My name's George Lopez. I came to Notre Dame in 1986 to help create the Kroc Institute of International Peace Studies. It then was called the Institute for International Peace Studies. And as incredible Mrs. Kroc kept giving us money, Father Ted got in this debate with her about the money she was going to give us to create the Hesburgh Center of International Affairs. And the debate went something like this. She said, I'm going to give you the money, but I'm only going to give you the money if your name goes on the building. And he said, my name can't go on the building. You don't understand what that will do around here because there's a Hesburgh library. Everybody in the library will be getting the wrong mail. We're not going to do that. There's no more Hesburgh buildings. Then she said, I'm not giving you the money. And in Father Ted's inimicable way, he said, well, it's your money, dearie. You do what you want with it, whatever. And, she wanted him to take the bait, and he wouldn't take the bait, right? So she said, come on, there must be a solution here. And his solution was, okay, it's called the Institute for International Peace Studies. Henceforth, it'll be called the Kroc Institute for International Peace Studies. She said, well, I don't want my name on it. He said, well, I don't want my name on the damn building either, right? I mean, you can tell Father Ted's, so they went up back and forth on this, back and forth and back and forth. She left campus without a decision about that, but said to him as he got to the airport with her, gee, is that a new plane? And she said, oh yeah, it's a new plane. You got to come in and see it, right? So Father Ted gets up, pokes his head in, and he says, it's a new plane. I'm going to bless your plane. He didn't wait for an answer from Joan about whether or not she wanted her plane blessed, but he blessed the plane, said, take off, see you later. As the story goes, as she's flying back to La Jolla, California with her entourage, etc., they hit an incredible amount of turbulence over the Sierra Madres. I mean, really scary stuff, right? They finally land safely in San Diego. She calls him that night and she says, you did that on purpose. And he says, I did what, dearie? And she said, oh, you blessed the plane because you knew we were going to run into that turbulence. He said, yeah, I have many powers, but I don't have power about that. I'm glad you're all right. She said, okay, you get the damn money. And he said, well, what does that mean? He said, she said, I'll put my name on the program if you put your name on the building. So that's why we became, in the early 1990s, the Joan Kroc Institute for International Peace Studies. In the summer of 2013, I got an interesting and marvelous invitation from the United States Institute of Peace, which is your tax-funded institution within the U.S. government that tries to help the best of U.S. interests and peace overseas, to go and work for them for a while as their vice president. And we decided on campus here, and in terms of what I thought would be my future of the next 5 to 7 years, that I would leave and go to D.C. and take early retirement emeritus status here. Washington being what it is, the 5 years to 7 years turned into 2. So I was back in the fall of 2015 and now split my time in the fall at Notre Dame doing various projects and sometimes teaching, and then out and about often at places that don't snow in January and February. If you're here long enough, you learn that. Maybe if you're only here 4 years, you learn that too. So I'm delighted to be asked to be here since I'm an alum of sorts as a faculty person, but still delighted to be connected as a emeritus. I'm sure there's a lot of experience and certainly opinion in this room about not only the state of violence in the world, but also what the prospects for peace might be. What I thought I would share with you over the next 25 to 30 minutes before we begin the larger discussion among us is what we have thought in the Kroc Institute for the last decade or more is the tasks of peace building that most need assistance, and the definition of peace building that's been changing over the last 2 decades. And that changing is of a particular kind. It's a changing that suggests, as important as the diplomats, the military people, the high negotiators who go in and try to forge a peace agreement in terrible situations, like Syria or Ukraine or elsewhere are, that the tasks of building peace, particularly after war, are much more the tasks of many, many, many different professions and people. And how we think about that, how we sketch that, how I think it leads all of us to think about a judgment of what kind of peace builder would we be, or are we, especially tapping some of your own experience in the room, that's where I'd like to get to by the end. So thank you for coming. I want to talk about the challenges and opportunities of the new peace building. 3 big questions. With all the world's violence, is there peace? You know that old phrase, peace, peace, there is no peace? Well, there's an era we're in where we could feel that. You know, one of the things that was clear to me the last time I walked into a Notre Dame classroom to a bunch of sophomores is if you look at their birth dates in 2013, all of them came to a political consciousness in a post 9/11 world, which means they've been involved in a permanent state of war. That's very different than our collections of folks. Some of you saw or were in World War II and the Korean War, many in the Vietnam experience, but our experience is even Cold War. They phased in and out, right? Now this group, not only global terrorism and various things associated with that, but the terror of Assyria, the ongoing terrible destruction of resources and people in the Congo and elsewhere, it just keeps going on and on. So do they even have a concept of peace or a sense that there might be peace? Okay, that's a big discussion. That's not the one we're going to have today, but we have to come to a conclusion, is there a prospect for peace, even in a world of big violence? Secondly, if there is, and Lopez and some of his friends say there is, but it's a new kind of peace, it's a peace building, what is that and what does it look like? And then ultimately, where do any of us fit? And I think that has some huge implications and has been played out at places like Notre Dame about what it means to think about the fit for people over time. What we do with people when they walk in the door, to say you're not only going to be an engineer, a great person in finance, a librarian, a teacher, a priest, or any number of other things avocationally, but you may also be a peace builder. So what about the violence? Overall, international affairs and peace research scholars, if they had the time, would sketch for you a lot of data charts that say, believe it or not, things have gotten a lot better, especially in the last 20 years. We used to be averaging somewhere between 45 and 60 wars a year, with a war defined as a conflict where there's more than 1,000 battle deaths. But now we're down to about 30. And of those 30, 21 of those conflicts are not traditional war of one state against another. They're internal, intra-state violence. And 9 others of the 30 are interstate violence with enough international and other state interference or involvement that they qualify as sort of this hybrid between the intra and the international violence. Civilian deaths since the 90s are actually down in number. But the problem is, in the kinds of wars that we see, Syria being even above this average, 85% of the people who are killed in internal wars these days are civilians. And I would submit, in a longer discussion, not by accident, but by design. Now, that presents a huge challenge to us. Long-term violence, these intrastate violence types, are much more difficult to end than old traditional war. Not the least of the reasons being old traditional war was the prime minister and the general, the dictator and his generals get together and they decide whether or not at a peace conference they can come to peace. In a place like Syria with 16 or 18 different fighting factions, look at the trouble we've had in Geneva over the last 5 years in trying to even get parties to sit down, complete with all the outside functioners like Iran, the United States, and Russia who have vested interest and are involved. So the deeply steep violence is much more embedded, much more deadly, much more difficult. But there were some of those cases that were like that a while back, which are now on the way to peace. So there may be some hope. Nepal, Colombia coming out of 50 years of violence, Burma, Liberia had dictators, genociders, and others 30 years ago. Now, last month, the United Nations took off the last of the arms embargo against Liberia. President Johnson Sirleaf has brought this country into not only prosperous democracy, but it being a very viable member of the international system. But it took almost 30 years. Peace agreements are being forged, but they succeed only about 50% of the time. There's a great project here in Kroc called the Peace Accords Matrix, which looks at 65 peace agreements over the last 40 years, analyzes them according to about 70 different factors or variables. So we know a lot more about what really disturbs the prospect of going from that great day of signing the peace treaty to it breaking down within the next 3 years. The key underlying summative aspect of all those variables is the problem is not in the design of the agreement, the problem is in the implementation. So we don't know how to get from the peace, or we're only 50% successful in getting from the peace accord to real peace in the lives of people continually over time after the accord is signed. Just like in church, the place that's left is the front. Come on down if you want, folks. Or we could say some of you folks on the edge, come together. Everybody will get a chance to put money in the collection at halftime here. Welcome. So, peace agreements, only about half the time. Implementation is the problem. In the great group I worked for nearly 2 years, the United States Institute of Peace, one of our guiding concerns was, were we trying to be helpful in what we called the life cycle of conflict? And the work that we did was traditionally in this phase, I got the magical thing here. In this phase of conflicts as they were moving to crisis points and violence might be on the outbreak stage, could we at very critical moments at the outbreak of violence do some peacemaking in any number of ways to lead to ceasefires and ultimately bring peace? Sometimes. Because we're not the only factor that drives or stops war, whether it's the United States or any of its agencies. The reality, as we discovered, particularly in the last decade, is if you want to end war when you can't prevent it, we're much more on this second half of the parabola. We're engaged in an enterprise in which sometimes we're strong enough in the international community and politically inclined to engage in a kind of peace enforcement, do some peacekeeping, and ultimately, when the shooting stops, look in the society and say, how do we do post-violence or post-conflict peace building? Now, that leads me to say, we're in an interesting time. We're in an era of what we might call peace something. There are three big types of peace. Peace enforcement, when you have the resources and the inclination to separate parties and hope that that separation time allows them, with outsiders' help, to work out the dispute. Peacekeeping, where the blue helmets of the UN and various other well-meaning countries in the African Union and elsewhere actually try to keep the peace, often against now not armies, but these intra-factions that, let's say like in Colombia, the great victory in Colombia is the defeat of the drug cartels. The biggest problem in Afghanistan is not so much the Taliban per se anymore as a fighting force, it's the Taliban's alliance with the Haqqani network, which is the largest drug exporter in the world. I was telling one of your good alumni members before we started, one of the conclusions I come to after 40 years in this business is crime and corruption are now the great enemies of peace. Not ideology, not religion, not ISIS. Crime and corruption drives transnational violence and sustains it in many places. Peacekeeping helps with that. But peace building is where we're going to focus. Now, where can peace happen? Peace can happen on the enforcement side if it's enforced through powerful coercive mechanisms on the bad guys, like sanctions, like the work of the UN, like the work of regional groups like the European Union or the African Union, and helpful non-governmental organizations. That gets even better if it can be strengthened by international peacekeeping forces. But if you want the critical yeast, as some of my colleagues have come to call it, the critical yeast of implementing peace agreements and making these official things really take hold, it's a large coalition of folks who are thinking and acting strategically about how you root peace and help it take hold in a culture that's been destroyed by internal violence. It's no longer about the peace treaty where the generals and the prime ministers and presidents sign it and they go back to their organized armies and say to everybody, go home and farm the land again. It doesn't work that way. Deeply embedded cross-community violence where brother has killed brother needs something else if peace is going to take hold. So we would say that the new peace building might actually be called strategic peace building. It needs to be thought about, it needs to be planned, it needs to be coordinated, and most important, given the data on why peace agreements fail, we have to think long term. How is it possible that we think a 30-year war can be healed and a country reconstructed in 3 years after a peace accord? See, one of our dilemmas in Afghanistan, despite our probably different sensibilities here about what's happening in Afghanistan, is if you only think that the Afghan conflict began in October of 2001, we have a problem. Because as you well know, it began with the Russian invasion in '79. That adds a lot of years. That means we weren't going to fix it or deal with it or dispense with the Taliban in a short amount of time. It was going to take much, much deeper investment of various kinds. I was privileged to be in my work at the U.S. Institute of Peace in the room with U.S. officials, the Colombian foreign minister to the U.S., and a number of Colombian officials 2 years ago when they came and said or asked the question, look, we know how to get to the peace agreement. We have enough trust. We have enough work with each other. We in the FARC are going to solve this. The problem is we don't have a clue as to what to do the day after. You specialists are supposed to know that. What would you tell us? And the first thing that we said that resonated with them is, you've had a 50-year war. You need a 50-year plan for peace. Because peace is a dramatic form of social change for the people who've been involved in nothing else but war for all of their lives. Social change doesn't occur over only one generation, as we know. I mean, think about this country and our current debate, our current angst, our current dislocations about race. Some of us in this room became politically conscious and active when we thought we were working to solve the race problem in America in the 60s. Get that legislation, do all these other things, and we're all equal brothers and sisters. Not exactly, because it's going to take a generation time, and generation after that. So the first aspect of strategic peace building is don't think 3 years, think 30. And that's going to demand a whole different focus. All the wonderful things that happen when mediators get together to resolve conflicts have to happen. But for too long, we've stopped at that point of resolving on paper the disputes and not actually transforming the experience and helping the participants transform the experience of living and working together. So conflict resolution, in which many of us were trained for decades, simply isn't enough anymore. We don't need just conflict resolution, we need conflict transformation. And we need to help our partners who've experienced war work through that. And this is the key for those of us in this room. Strategic peace building helps us identify the needs that insider-outsider partnerships can address and help facilitate. Peace comes, or our theory of change for bringing peace, comes about when there's a coalition of insiders and outsiders who do a lot of good listening to the insiders about what they need, but they know they're strapped for personnel, resources, ideas for what worked elsewhere. And that coalition of insiders and outsiders, that's what helped brings peace. The first, the idea that we need structures, we need new approaches, we need to think long term. My colleague John Paul Lederach, 20 years ago, said if you want peace, you need top leadership working to do certain kinds of things. We need middle range leadership, which in some cultures is the agrarian unions. In other cultures, it's the business sector. And we got to think about all the grassroots. Do you know there are some communities in Colombia that are celebrating the 20th or 30th anniversary of the local peace commission, which meant that regional groups had decided, this is screwy. We don't need this war, okay? And we need to find ways to organize, even in our differences, to make sure that neither the guerrillas nor the armies are going to come in and help persuade us to be otherwise, other than for one another. And that grassroots movement helped build legitimacy for the middle sectors and the top leadership in the guerrillas and the government to think about the prospects at the peace table. And the strength of those meant this was one of the peace accords that might actually take hold. Interestingly, what people on this campus have done very well is we've recognized that one of the key structures that moves from top to bottom here, the Colombian Catholic Church. So when the Colombian Council of Bishops, the National Association of Bishops, came out in favor of the prospects for a peace accord 3 years ago, and they said, we're a vertically interested group and vertically organized from the smallest favelas all the way down to the largest parish in Bogota. We're for peace. That helped close the pyramid even tighter. When you move from conflict resolution to conflict transformation, you're really trying to help groups do three things. Structural changes, what new institutions, big ways of life, big patterns of living together do we need to change? Or do we need to invent? One of the challenges of this kind of peace building is it's not like solving an engineering problem, or let me change it. It's not like solving a structural problem in an economy where you say, okay, that theory applies. Let's deduce from that theory what the solution might be. Strategic peace building demands that we invent new solutions. And inventing them means you not only have to look at the changes that are needed structurally or attitudinally in people, but you need some space and time for trial and error. Peace accords break down in the first 3 years because there's not enough space and time for trial and error. The first bomb that goes off on the plaza that's attributed to the bad guy group of 6 years ago leads an insecure government to say, see, I told you they're not committed to peace. And then we're back at one another's throats. So the movement from conflict resolution to conflict transformation is important, but it takes structural, attitudinal, and transactional ways of getting there. Now, these insider-outsider relationships that many of us believe are key are not only what relationships are about, that is, new good ways to accompany and partner and invest and to think about our local organization, whether it be our local church or our sister city program linking up anew with some other groups in what's now trying to no longer be a war-torn country, but it's also in particular assessing when and where new ad hoc groups of volunteers and professionals might help with peace. And our experience is that these come in the oddest, but for us who live in peace, some of the most regular everyday forms. In this cycle of peace, in this post-conflict peace building tasks that fall to communities trying to come out of violence range all the way from needing ways to have new community dialogues, interfaith, interethnic, sometimes intergenerational dialogues. And who's good at facilitating that? Who are the international and domestic lawyers who can engage in war crimes accountability? Who are the folks who can help improve human rights, manage post-violence trauma? I mean, imagine children growing up in Syria between the ages of 3 and 8. That's about the scope of the war we're looking at. What's the prospect for that child having a normal adulthood, especially if they left an area that was bombed, they're living in a refugee camp? Wow, what do you do with that, right? So, translate that generic list of needs to specific avocational or vocational things that any number of us in this room have done or might do. Religious peace builders, religious activists who believe from their own cluster of beliefs that people can be all considered children of God and can come together. Educators to help rebuild destroyed school systems. Or, as some of my colleagues have worked with folks in the Palestinian-Israeli community, how you rewrite 7th grade textbooks so that they don't have this enemy image of the other, and that kids aren't socialized into the only thing that keeps you from a prosperous and peaceful life is them. And how you burst those stereotypes, being so critical. Healthcare professionals of all types. I gave a talk at University of Massachusetts at Lowell about a year ago on a similar topic. A woman came up to me afterwards, gave me her card. She said, I'm so glad to hear you say what you said because I'm in U.S. dental schools recruiting volunteers like crazy to go with me to Rwanda because as good as the rebuilding after the genocide has been, there are no pediatric dental specialists in Rwanda. So I try to line up 1 month of service from people to help with pediatric dentistry. The hospitals in Syria, in Democratic Republic of Congo, in Yemen are flattened. The crooks and the marauders have taken all the pharmaceutical goods. Doctors are usually some of the best off people in a culture. When things get really bad, they leave. So how do we restore health care there? You know, there's ways in which the Ebola outbreak of last year and the year before is a direct function of the Civil War era in Sierra Leone and in Liberia, where one of the last sectors to be repaired was the healthcare system. So we lost all the local clinics that would have been first responders at the recognition of Ebola. And we're only able in mid-epidemic to get that back in, mostly through insider-outsider coalitions. And it goes on and on and on. Social workers and child psychologists to assist with trauma recovery, and people committed to the arts and peace building, whether that be street theater, creative poetry that builds from the experience and calls forth hope in a new day. All of that, and all of that together constitutes the peace-building agenda. So, tonight, back in your hotel room, when you're finishing having fun with all those good old class friends, Google Without Borders. Some of you may have already done this in your past life. And what do we have? Doctors Without Borders being one of the most famous groups. Teachers Without Borders. Engineers Without Borders, which is unique in our culture because now you have some of the best engineering programs with their undergraduates telling them why this is a professional obligation in the future. One of the things we did as I was leaving USIP is we were designing the conflict transformation curriculum that would be a 1-credit course over 3 different semesters, 1 credit, 1 credit, 1 credit, in conflict transformation for engineers as programmed learning. Fascinating. Translators Without Borders. I don't think that person's here, but 3 or 4 years ago, I got an email from a Notre Dame student who had been in one of my classes. They were working with Clowns Without Borders. And in wonderful Notre Dame style, dear professor, we haven't talked in about 6 years, but I wanted you to know I'm doing this interesting thing. I think you'd love it. I'm working in Jordan in refugee camps. Love, Fred. Okay, Fred who, right? But great. But look where it goes. And it goes, and it goes, and it goes, as we know in this world in which we live. So, in the Kroc Institute, thinking about not only the tasks of strategic peace building, but watching our graduates and undergraduates who never actually appeared in any of our classes, but later, like Fred, write us and say, I'm doing one of these things. We just simply sent out a survey to about 500 people who we thought were working in this area, trying to see, well, can we get more specific than the without borders thing? And I'll show this a little bit backward. This is the summative chart, and then I'll break it down because it's kind of interesting to reinforce the points. The strategic peace-building pathways that people were doing vocationally or avocationally, all of these Notre Dame alums fell in 3 areas. Those structural and institutional changes that needed to be done, some of it in economic development, the justice and healing, the transactional stuff, and the conflict prevention, conflict resolution, and conflict transformation. Interesting big areas. Now, what did they look like in form? They took a little bit more shape when we broke them down a little bit to more specific areas, but here's where it gets really intriguing. Boom, justice and healing. Who's working in justice and healing? Everybody from working from community-based justice to people working in prison systems. People working at a very high level, like prosecuting war criminals at the International Criminal Court, or helping people rebuild national justice systems that are not corrupt. Trauma healing, either with child soldiers. We've had 4 former child soldiers that we know of go through the MA and Kroc over the years. One of them is now a faculty person in the Peace and Conflict Transformation program in Portland State University after being here. Post-crisis social work support for families and communities, decades after the traumas. Humanitarian action, including linking people who are now refugees in your culture, how when they want to be helpful to refugees from their culture who are elsewhere, they can link up with them. There's a lot of different professions that tie into that, and a lot of different volunteer possibilities. And then you go to this one. Humanitarian action can range from direct work for human rights to public health, working specifically with governmental organizations. A lot of U.S. military people are helping African Union governments understand what demobilization and demilitarization and the reintegration of fighting forces happens to be. And it's a lot more than just collecting guns. It's finding out that troops coming in from years of fighting, the most important thing to them is not the fighting, it's the people they've been with. So if you want to create an employment opportunity that binds all of them together. And they become an employment cluster because their loyalties are to one another and their success they see tied to one another. That's a psychological or social psychological issue. It's got nothing to do with demilitarization, except demilitarization always fails if you break up the units. Nonviolent social change, community organizing. Who would have thunk it? That community organizing, whether it was in Chicago or New York or San Francisco, is a transnationally useful profession. Absolutely. How to build reconciliation. Lots of your undergraduate majors may have been involved. And again, education, from vocational to the challenge of, okay, here's a room of child soldiers. Many of them abducted or choosing to go fight between the ages of 9 and 15. Now they're 29. Most of them can't read. How do you run a school for people at that age who can't read or really do math, and it's going to be key to their reintegration of the society? And by the way, do it in a way in which they don't feel like they're stupid. We need educators of high quality. And it goes on. Critical economic development work. How to build sustainable agriculture, how to build jobs that are real and matter and can grow, how to do microfinance. Think about the urban and housing reconstruction tasks and cost in Syria. I know people who say, I don't remember this except for seeing pictures of Berlin at the end of the war, which may mean you need a what? You need a Marshall Plan for Syria, or for Syria and Iraq and elsewhere. And it goes on and on. The key is what we call the Kroc Peacebuilding wheel shows that there are spaces for everyone, vocationally and avocationally. So, as we begin our discussion, where do you fit? What's been your experience? Or, I don't have any experience, but I'm so excited, tell me what I'm supposed to do. So where do you fit? Are you a without borders person? Because you fit in one of those interesting, well-defined professional niches where a transnational effective organization already exists? Are you somebody who says, look, you know what? I run a school for 3rd and 4th graders. That's what I do. It takes every emotional and other space I have. That's fine. How are you doing that locally, but thinking globally, so that those kids have a sense of how to navigate the world of violence that besets them? Or the day into your tight, wonderful classroom comes the first Syrian refugee, or the Yemeni refugee. Where do you want to be inspiring, inventing, or connecting? And do you have a plan for how to get there? You know, none of these presentations come without that good old Catholic guilt, you know. I mean, so that's the beginning of the Catholic guilt line. So, let's throw it open. Please, and identify yourself and your class year.
I'm Curlin, class of 1966. I have some familiarity with the U.S. Institute of Peace and Dick Solomon and your good work there. I would like you to go a bit further into the issue of gender, because I think women suffer particularly from war and conflict, and especially the economic development and microfinance. What is possible there, what is being done there, because I think that is one of the more opportune situations in many of these conflicts, as well as one of the most difficult problems to solve.
Thank you. One of the things that was most interested about working with the Colombians is the Colombians said to us early on, you know, a high percentage of people in FARC were women combatants. Our understanding from the research is that that's a problem that's never been encountered before. And we said to them, you're absolutely right, right? But there are findings that are very, very clear from peace accords that work, unless they're inclusive of women's experience of whether it's victimhood or solely carrying the family, or what it means to be part of a peace process and integrated to that, and economic recovery and social and political advancement, then peace isn't successful. And it's way beyond Security Council Resolution 1325 in terms of women. The most poignant thing I heard from my colleagues who sat at the peace negotiation table in Havana was the day that 4 generals of the Colombian army met 4 commanders from FARC to talk about the demobilization of the southwestern region. The 4 FARC commanders were women. Historically, it's never happened before. But the key to your question and the key answer is, that's not the big deal. The big deal is Colombia is a society that prides itself in literate women, that has high women participation in colleges and universities, that can't go forward as a vibrant, peaceful society without that gender dynamic being consciously built in. USAID, various international agencies are running with that, saying this is what makes for a peaceful future country. And people are trying to operationalize it. Absolutely critical. It's like the 2nd or 3rd most important finding for what solidifies a peace agreement. And it's what drives you crazy if you're trying to work for peace agreements in Iraq or Afghanistan, when a culture is so pervasively locked women into a particular place. Please.
we had some familiarity with some church work we did in Nicaragua and what we've learned about the Contras and the Sandinistas. Is that in your bailiwick?
Not personally, but I know a good deal about it, and my colleague John Paul was very involved in that.
Yeah, and it seems that in that environment, they seem to work it out fairly quickly.
No.
They decided internally to put the war aside. Literacy rose fairly quickly when that happened.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm wondering, is there something to be plucked from that dynamic that would apply elsewhere?
Yeah, excellent. Two things. One, to go back to one of our principles earlier, if we just bargained out who was guilty for what and who gets what at the end of the war, that's conflict resolution. If we sit down and say, you killed my people, I killed your people, this was a terrible part of our history, the question is, will our grandchildren live in peace? And how will you and I create that? Then it's a different ballgame. That's conflict transformation. And to their credit, the Nicaraguan governments, the conservatives, the military, and the people were willing to vest in creating that future. It's been bumpy, but it's way different than Honduras. Very different from what we saw with our poor Mexican friends over the last 3 or 4 years. And one of the achievements of the Nicaraguans, in my mind, was as a rule of law culture, they were committed to there being no crime and corruption running the system, which is different from what we see in Ukraine or Russia or in a number of other places that are struggling to get to peace. So I think those are two of the big takeaways. Sir?
John Fish,
You're next.
class of 56. This may be a little bit off to the right side. Do you face what I would call non-transformative situations? I would assume Syria today would probably come close to classifying that. I'm thinking of you've got one man in power who's backed up by a couple of guns, more than a couple, and how do you dent that?
Yeah.
Maybe it's another question.
No, it's not a loaded question. I mean, I think that the thing that's most difficult about the outbreaks of terrible violence over the last 2 decades is what's one of the most non-changeable things in each of your lives? For many in this room, it's their religious beliefs. Okay? So, if religion may not be at the root of, but religion is the best expression of the us versus them, rivaled secondly only by the incomparable drive to keep power for you, you put those together, yeah, that's what makes those things so difficult to transform. Which means, to go back to the triangle pyramid of John Paul, is we're going to have to work very, very hard on the bottom sector and the middle sector and strengthen them if the people at the top keep jumping up on the soapbox and say, the reason we're having trouble is because of them, hate them and kill them. Because sooner or later, those stronger sectors are going to be able to toss out those people. Happened in Yugoslavia. Okay, part of the reason we got a Dayton Peace Accord was because we could then have the ceasefires that pumped lots of international money into those primary and secondary sectors, and it took 4 years, but then Milosevic was gone. Through democratic election, by the way. Yes, 2 women in the back.
I'm a spouse of a 66 and an activist from the 60s. In your example of the Colombian Catholic Church and the political stream that was coming up, am I hearing a little bit of liberation theology?
From me? Our young colleagues who are doing joint degrees in Theo and peace research would say, yes, but you're hearing post-liberation theology. Yes, yes. And you're hearing the power, even in the last 3 years, of Francis. You're hearing a recognition that beliefs are meant to not divide people, but bring people together. And you're hearing and seeing an elite Catholic Church of bishops who understand you don't have to subscribe to liberation theology to still be associated with the victimhood of violence, and that's counter the gospel. And before, there was a rationale that said, I don't want anybody to be victims of violence, but if they're Marxist, it's their fault. Okay? So that change is significant, I think. And it's important to see, this is not the only case. You know where the other case is the Philippines, where the Philippines bishops got on the bandwagon of, we will not be at war with Islam in this country. And that's very, very important for dealing with the Moro group and forging that peace agreement.
Thank you. Okay, I'm 66 as well.
What is 66? What is it? It's your year. Who had that idea?
You mentioned Israel is the conflict of all religion and how we often have such strong religious beliefs. Do you see any way that the Sunnis and the Shiites will ever come to agreement on anything to help solve the Middle East problem?
I'm looking at my friends in the room who have some specialization in Arabic studies and things, and she's shaking her head. That doesn't help. So are one or two of you going to bail me out on this? Please.
I'm a pessimist. My name is Lance Corey, class 71. Everything I've studied the last 45 years tells me we're in the end times. And it's not that we're at war with Islam, but Islam is most definitely at war with everyone who's not a Muslim. But
Okay.
the Muslims themselves know it. I'd like your comment on that.
Thomas Fay, class of 1961. Islam is at war with itself. One of the huge problems in the world is with the collapse of the empires, beginning at the end of World War I and continuing and greatly accelerating at the end of World War II. You had areas carved out, said this is the country of Iraq. Iraq wasn't a country, it was some lines drawn on a map by Winston Churchill and a couple of other people. It wasn't a country. At that time, it had a better chance to become a country perhaps if other things were done, but it wasn't a country. You
Yeah.
don't have equality there, and you have two groups that, quite frankly, to a large extent, hate each other. The question in a lot of these things is, what reasonable separation you make in these areas which will allow peace to come. You mentioned Doctors Without Borders, and recently one of those was attacked. That didn't surprise me at all. In Israel, where I spent an amount of time, and in Libya and in East Africa, the kind of place that gets attacked, first of all, is a place that gives medical treatment to the people living there, either entirely without pay or almost without pay. Why? Because the people are grateful for that, and that starts building up confidence in the government. Second of all, it's a soft target in addition to that. It's a place you first want to eliminate if you're the Shia far outs or the Sunni far outs, and it's more easily attacked. A shopping center in Israel, you've got to go through security. Everybody does going into a shopping center.
Thank you.
Jim Doherty, class of 66. I've been involved with a process back home where it's called dialogue racism. And it's basically dealing with blacks and whites, but it's dealing with getting people to sit down with one another, blacks, whites, or whatever, and talk about their upbringing, their experiences. And I have a friend who's been working in Bosnia dealing with this dialogue too. And the dialogue basically has the people sit down in a non-confrontational way and talk about their life experience and how they got there. And doing it several times over the course of a month, 2 months, or even over a weekend. And the process involves people listening closely to one another, not responding to one another, but just talking about their own experience and their views of certain things that are presented to them. And the process brings people together sort of on an emotional level where they look across the room and say, those people are different from me. And then in the course of this process, they begin to say, wow, they're just like me, but they've had a different life experience. And it's a process that I think could be, and I'm sure maybe you can tell us more if you know of it in other places. I think it's the only process I know where you can bring people together in these conflict areas.
I'm going to get to each of these once we have the last.
Just
No, identify yourself.
information questions may take away off close to home. The 1916 Rising celebrated here in Ireland. Did anything unique or different come from George Lopez? Talk about something that lasts 100 years and how people are still, talk about bloody British, et cetera, and your Irish family and all that. Did anything come from his investment that folks like you learn something from?
Yeah, great. Thank you for the range of this. I think it's perfectly plausible for any number of us all the time or on a given day to say the end is near. I used to have one of those Peanuts cartoons that I'd show in Intro to Peace Studies after we did the War and Devastation section of the class. The students were like walking in for another day of pestilence and terribleness. And it's, of course, Lucy holding the sign, the end of the world is coming, right? So the next day we could put up Charlie Brown coming in and saying, what a bright and beautiful day. This is not meant to trivialize your view or some of the good responses about how difficult it is. But somewhere in your great books work or a history course in the past, we probably spent some time on the 100 Years' War in Europe, the nature of the interreligious dynamic there. If you were the Sean Hannity of the day, you'd say, this is crazy. These Protestants just slaughtering everybody. These Catholics, they want to make everybody like them, and on and on and on. It seemed insurmountable, and it was for 100 years. 30. What was the 100 Years' War then?
Between Britain and France. Religious.
Too many wars. But thank you. You learn something in every class. That's what I like about being a prof. So, I mean, what I want to emphasize here is the issue that twofold. It is terrible, but we have had terrible before. And what's worked in terrible before is the nurturing of sectors that still have identities and have identity competition and recognition of their differences, but don't believe that that's a license to kill. And they're the ones that we have to find ways in the tradition I've sketched to bond with. They're the ones whose kids we've got to let into American high schools and universities. They're the ones who we have to find ways for our community groups to outreach to. Because when all the dust clears, whether it's 10 years or 30 years, we're going to need folks who understand what happened and ensure that it doesn't happen again. So, let me get to this thing about dialogue. One of the little boxes on the charts in the conflict transformation said dialogue methods. The hottest technique over the last 5 to 7 years is what's called the technique of facilitated dialogue. Exactly your experience. We at USIP and a number of good professional programs have been running dialogue training workshops for US people and particularly for international people for a couple of years. Community dialogue in smaller groups, built to larger groups, built to slightly larger groups, maybe maxed at 300, that seems to work dramatically. That is, to get an exchange of information, to get a sense of empathy, to get a sense of moving from what divides us to what can be in a future. It seems to work dramatically well. And then a group of Tunisians with a huge benefit of human hope said 2 years ago, we're going to take this national. So if you want to know why Tunisia is different than every other North African country, is because they took it national. And every peace-building researcher that I knew is now spending time in Tunisia trying to figure out, how did these people do it? How did they connect groups of 300 to be 35,000 and work out a reasonable democratic system and even try to figure out how the most radical Islamicists were allowed in the room, provided they left the guns and the belts outside. And I mean that very, very seriously. It is the technique of the future. What we used to think was getting to yes or finding ways to negotiate agreement without giving in. All of that stuff is so 80s, 90s, 2000s. The new thing at the community level, built to all the way to national models, is facilitated dialogue. Already there are plans from the Dutch and the Norwegians for how to run a facilitated dialogue in Yemen once you get the shooting to stop. So that's how strong this is. That community experience you have is significant. There were ways in which folks in the Department of Justice and Community Relations Service ran these things in Ferguson as well. This is really where the future is. Let me say one other thing here. Go ahead.
Well, I was interested in preventing the violence before it even starts. I lived in South Africa for a year and a half, and I see that country deteriorating. I mean, Mandela and a couple successors are followed by Zuma, where corruption, which you brought up, is. I can see that leading to all this violence because the infrastructure's crumbling. They can't keep the electricity on.
Yeah.
So how do you take a country like South Africa that might not get attention like some of these other spots because it's not full blown in there? And what do you do now to prevent it from becoming a big, huge thing if the ANC loses power and they,
Okay.
try to prevent it to
Good, and I realize I didn't answer the Irish question either, so let me handle these two, because these are great examples of, it's not just the division among the visible factions, it's also the division among generations. The specific answer about George Mitchell, 3 things. 1, Mitchell had the full backing of the US government, and he went into both sides and he said, we're out of patience. You guys come and go like crazy, and you do fundraising in Boston and New York, you keep your movements going, there's all sorts of stuff. All of that shuts down, and it doesn't happen anymore unless we get an agreement. You've come close 4 or 5 times, so he did a little strong-arming. Then he was followed by Richard Haas, who's now the president of the Council on Foreign Relations, and Richard went in and said, and I've been authorized to tell you the following members of each side who will now be put on the U.S. Treasury specially designated sanctions list. Your assets will be frozen. All the following things will happen that happen to all bad guys who can't get to peace. And the third thing that happened, which is very significant, is that other international agencies offered, and it was on the table, we will work with your local police, we will work with religious leaders, we will work with educators to make sure that communities find a way to come together. And that tripod Mitchell drove into the ground, and he said, look, the only thing that stops you from saying yes is your damn Irish stubbornness and this continued appeal to history because of this. We want to get to the future to do that, and that. Now, 10 years later, you have some segments of the society saying, we were intimidated into this. Damn Americans, or any number of other things. Interesting lesson there that's the same as South Africa in portion, and that is the momentum to build peace in communities is supported by a particular generation, a particular set of experiences. But later, some sectors take advantage of that for their own profit and betray the peace one way. Others, not trying to betray the peace, look at their parents or grandparents and say, you did what? I mean, I have a good South African colleague here who comes and goes between Cape Town and Notre Dame and teaches in both places. Very close to Tutu, very much part of that. His children say to him, we got no reparations for all of that? This just tell the truth and you're off the hook? 25 years later, a generation says, that was crazy, that was stupid. That showed you were still pounded by the system. We never have justice unless we have reparations. Whereas everybody who was the Tutu people said, no, we have a country, we rule it, etc. And then somebody says, no, we don't rule it. Look at the guy who rules it, lining his pockets. Okay? So it tells us that that 30-year peace thing, that 50-year peace thing has to be worked at day after day, sector after sector. And crime and corruption continue to undermine peace. Last point with you all. Excuse me. So, here's what I've learned in 40 years of teaching, delightfully. Draw a line here, and probably for the first 25 years, my life was spent here. If you were sophomores coming into my international relations or intro to peace class, I'd look out there the first day as we're giving out the syllabus, and I'm thinking, gee, I wonder who it could be. I wonder who's going to be right there 20 years from now as a general or a undersecretary of state or somebody who's going to say, oh, I remember when Professor Lopez said in moments of crisis, leaders see their alternatives narrowing, so we need people who generate alternatives, and you're going to do it, and you're going to get us to the great peace. 1 out of 70 of you must be there, out there somewhere, and I'm going to find you somewhere in the course of the semester. Now, in this world, I don't have to find you, you're here. You're in finance in Mendoza. You're in the Great Books program. You're an engineer. You're an architect. You're about to go to medical school. In fact, the peace building of everyone is our time. So I can still teach the principles of how to get to the peace, but it's most people in the room most of the time. And maybe not even, as I'm sure is the experience of some of you, knowing enough Notre Dame alums, may not be the experience of your first 25 years. After that, you find a way to give it away for good, to do the common good, to build social justice or peace. But that's the key. Largest percentage of people applying for the U.S. Peace Corps, age cohort 52 to 60. Why? Made their money, kicked the kids out of the house, always wanted to go to work in Venezuela. Now's the time. And guess what? You're beating out all our seniors trying to get into the Peace Corps because you have all these skills. But bless you, go do. So, I thank you for being here. I think we're supposed to be on time. Sharon, are you about to say something?
No, Rick, please wrap it up. I just had a reminder.
Okay. Thank you for coming. I'm available via email if you want to continue the dialogue. It's lopez.1@nd.edu. I think you're supposed to fill these out and say that, oh my gosh, the radical professors still do exist at Notre Dame. They never graduated the 60s. Sir?
If I may, can I just make a quick announcement that if people would like a short essay of 2,362 words explaining the peaceful, violent, and confusing nature of Islam, and that includes a discussion of 14 centuries of jihadist holocaust, and actually talking about the real Islam of Muhammad, not all the other types. Although I do go into them very briefly to explain, please come by and put your email address on this, and I'll be happy to send it to you by email. I wish I had my card with me because I just ran out of them. On the flip side is my memorial to 9/11, which is in the headquarters of Peace Days Children in Manhattan.
Okay.
Because the children are everything. We needed this. We need to talk a lot more.
Thank you. If you're interested in the Kroc wheel, that's how you get to the Kroc wheel on the Notre Dame website. Thank you.